Labdien! Esiet sveicināti mūsu šīs dienas diskusijā Krievijas karš Ukrainā, drošības sekas Baltijas jūras reģionam. Diskusija notiks angliski, bet, ja jums ir nepieciešams austiņas, lai saņemtu tulkojumu, tad lūdzu paceliet roku, jums te brīvprātīgie pienāks klāt un iedos austiņas, lai jūs varat saprast. Un tagad es pāriešu uz angļu valodu. Hello, greetings to today's discussion, Russia's war in Ukraine, the security consequences for the Baltic Sea region. This is a topic that is being talked about not just here in LAMPA, all over the place, but in Latvia all the time. So I don't think I have to give a lot of introduction to why this is important and what has happened. But I think just to start off, I'll make one crucial point, which is on February 24th, 2022, when the rockets started flying from Russia and striking Kiev and Kharkiv and all the other cities where they were aimed at, this was not only the start of a huge and very bloody and brutal war, it also meant the collapse of a series of illusions in many capitals in Europe and in other places in the world. And the question is, what are the consequences of this, and specifically for our region? And we have today here I think an excellent panel that sort of goes all around the Baltic Sea. I'll start with, at that end is Mr. Robert Tomaszewski. He is responsible for the energy sector at Politica Insight, a Warsaw-based think tank. Hello, Robert.
Hello.
Nice to see you here. Then Professor Kjell Engelbrecht is professor of political science at the Swedish Defense University. And Kai Olaf Lang is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, a foreign policy think tank based in Berlin. Hello, Kai Olaf. And my name is Paul Strauceps. I'm a journalist here in Latvia. I often write about security and politics, and so I'll try to hold up the Baltic end of this discussion, if that's okay with the rest of the people taking part. I think the first question, speaking about the security situation, is from the Baltic point of view, of course, and the Polish point of view. We've been talking about the fact that Russia is a threat for a long time, and there's always been the sense that the further west people are, the less they're willing to hear this. But then the question is, I mean, considering the fact that we've been warning about this for a long time, has the beginning of the war in Ukraine and these 4 months that the war has been going on, has it really changed the security situation for us? Sometimes we even hear that people saying we're actually more secure now because Russia is wasting its soldiers, its missiles, its tanks, its armored personnel carriers, its howitzers. They're all being destroyed by the Ukrainian military, and they're using all these munitions. Maybe we're safer right now than we were before. So that's the first question I'm going to throw out, and I'd like to hear your opinions about that. Maybe Robert, you started at the other end.
I think that it was a very important moment of 24th of February, and what you said about that Baltic states, Poland, were presenting some diagnosis many years before about what Russia was doing with gas, with oil, using those resources as a tool in trying to influence their neighbors. So suddenly West started to listen to Eastern Europe, their diagnosis with much more carefully than years before. So it has big implications because it shows that we predicted that this kind of situation could happen. And of course, 24th of February, the war started, it ignited all the energy crisis in whole Europe. We can face now extremely high prices of electricity, energy, fuels. It is driving our inflation high. It is slowing down our economies. So it creates a lot of social tensions in the short term. But on the other hand, it's extreme factor, extreme impulse that it will push our transformation forward. We see general consensus all around Europe that we need to get rid of the fossil fuels. The fossil fuels are the power machine of Kremlin, which is fueling the war in Ukraine. So the fast we will drop our dependence on coal, drop our dependence on gas, the faster we can be more independent from Russia and spend less money on those critical now resources. So, but the problem is that this hope that it can change, the process of the carbonization can speed up. It's the promise which will be fulfilled maybe in 20 years. So we have to somehow go through a very critical moment for the European economy. And this is the moment when sometimes we're going to need to eat our socks by, for example, restarting some coal-fired plants. What we see, for example, in Germany, in Austria, in Holland. So in countries which declared that they are on a fast pace of the decarbonization process. So this kind of loopholes in this process of going to climate neutrality will, if the war will go still on, will be enlarged. So we're going to have to create those loopholes, because otherwise we won't survive this. So by loopholes, I'm thinking about the state intervention. So this is the major change we see after 24th of February, that liberal market, on the energy market, for example, is not working in a way that we can be safer. So we need state, we need public funds to get the money to people who need it. They cannot deal with the high energy bills, and to make our energy systems more safer.
Robert, if I could just ask you, but are there any particular implications for the Baltic Sea region from what you're saying right now? I mean, because we've often heard about for instance, the Baltic states being an energy island. Now we see this gas connector between Poland and Lithuania and so forth. I mean, how do you see this particularly?
This is absolutely a very important issue. We launched this interconnector between Poland and Lithuania in the beginning of May. So now our energy security is interdependent. Mm-hmm. We can use together the LNG terminal in Klaipėda. Also, Poland can pump some LNG gas to the Baltic Sea. It will also, I think, speed up the process of synchronization of our electricity grids, which will still wait until 2025. But the example of Ukraine is great. They just did it in the day of war. A few days after it, they were synchronized, their electricity grids, with the rest of the Europe. So Baltic states, which are still waiting for this moment to be synchronized with the rest of the continent, can easily join, of course, after building some additional infrastructure. So, but the bottom line here is that, and it's for the rest of the Europe, the gas is not going to be the transition fuel in a way we thought it would be, not only because it's a Russian gas, but, and it means basically that we need to jump to the more renewable future, more green hydrogen future, faster than we thought. So this is also very important for Baltic states and Poland and their cooperation in coming years.
Okay, I'm going to move to Shell now. Has the fact that Russia has actually pulled the trigger and attacked Ukraine significantly changed the security situation in our region, or has it just sort of revealed the threats that always existed?
Well, I guess a bit of both. It's not that Sweden and Finland weren't aware that Russia poses a security threat to the region. It's rather that the idea was that it's a security threat that can be managed and can be managed within existing institutions. And if we also on our end address the increasing military asymmetry that we've been seeing in the Baltic Sea region, for instance, with the remilitarization of Kaliningrad, then it's something to be managed. But two things really happened here. On February 24th, we saw Russia unleash military power on a scale that we hadn't anticipated. What we thought was that we would get the annexation of Crimea 2.0. We thought there would be an annexation of Donbass. That's basically what most people predicted. And this much bigger imperial ambition on the part of the Kremlin was a surprise to most people who don't study Russia day by day, basically. So that's a new thing. The other thing, which is perhaps not so apparent to people outside of Sweden and Finland, is that this challenge to the European security order that this constituted. And if you remember, we sometimes forget, I think, but starting in November and December with the massing of the troops alongside the border of Ukraine, there was this assertion on the part of Russia that there will be no more NATO expansion, there will be no more offensive military systems stationed close to our borders, and the door to NATO accession will be shut. That was something that the Swedes and the Finns paid a lot of attention to, because we liked that open door. we thought, fine, we're trying to deal and manage with the security threat here in the region. We've been doing that for a long time. Perhaps we can contribute to a more relaxed atmosphere as during the Cold War. But the combination of trying to shut that door to NATO accession and the brutality of the unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, that was what changed the minds of the Finns and the Swedes. And then, of course, we've had the increasingly asymmetry of the situation militarily in the Baltic Sea region that we've been trying to address kind of continually. And perhaps then, from the Swedish vantage point, I should argue that we've also had this kind of the Finland argument. We did not want to join NATO because we thought that the geopolitical pressures from the east on Finland would increase. And that would be to the detriment to Finland especially, but even to us and to the broader region. When Finland said, oh God, we want to join NATO, then that got flipped on its head. So now we have a Finland argument that said we should join, otherwise we are not going to provide Finland with the strategic depth that it needs. So these are four very good arguments for looking at the security situation differently. And the conclusion is Sweden and Finland should join NATO.
Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later and about Madrid. I wanted to ask Kai Olaf, I mean, I think in Germany especially, the reaction has attracted a lot of, from our point of view, very positive attention. The degree to which Germany has been willing to say, yes, we want to stop using Russian energy, we want to invest more in military, in our military and military aid to Ukraine, although there's questions about that, but certainly the response has been notable. How deep do you think the understanding is in Germany, and how much has Germany really internalized the threats that Russia has revealed by this invasion?
Just allow me, before this important question, to respond to what has been said on your original question on what has changed in the Baltic Sea and for its security. I would say three major aspects in the mid and long term. Of course, with Finland and Sweden joining, the geopolitical and security equation of the whole region is fundamentally changing. A region which, when we look back in the good old times of the 1990s, a period of hope, when some thought the eastern part of the Baltic Sea region is an interface and cooperation zone between the new West and the new Russia. And this is now an area of conflict. Now this will be, and we all know these pictures and metaphors, an internal sea of the NATO to a high degree, and of the EU, by the way. So in a way, this equation is changing. Second, we have a regionalization of NATO, which also I think was confirmed during the summit, a focus on reinforcing not only what has been called in a very vague manner, the eastern flank. We have this northeastern flank, which is now deepened, and then we have a sort of changing awareness. I would not, and that comes also to your question regarding Germany, go as far as to say we have a convergence of threat perceptions between, let's say, France, Germany, Latvia, and Poland, but we have a process not only of sobering, especially in Germany, but a situation where the basic assumptions of security policy, of Eastern policy, of Russland politic are shattered. Yeah, so there is no peace in Europe against Russia. That was one of the assumptions of the German paradigm. Yeah. Now we also see that there is no peace with Russia, at least in the way as we have it in the moment, and that's why the German Chancellor 3 days after the war broke out, had this impressive speech of Zeitenwende, where he said we have a watershed moment, and we have to invest very much in the Bundeswehr and its modernization. The open question for me is, money is one thing, and doing the modernization of arms, but the socialization of power is something different. So the German society, the German political class, has to be made deeply conscious of what risk this is, not only for the Baltic states or Poland, but that this is also a threat to ourselves. So, last sentence, Germany has experienced a process of profound demilitarization after 1989. And one of the German intellectuals, Herfried Münkler, recently said, there are still elements of a submissive pacifism in German public. Not at the moment, of course, in this moment of shock, but they have not vanished. So it will need a lot of leadership, also domestically, to say that we have to be aware of what is going on and that the times of stability and peace and cooperativeness to a high extent are over.
Do you see that the readiness to lead in this direction in the German elite?
Yes and no. There is some ambivalence because, of course, there is a deeply rooted hesitance. The Germans have a problem with leadership, also before February the 24th. Maybe Germany has to learn a little bit from the Americans because many want American leadership, but once the leader does something, he's criticized for that. And so the Germans want to be loved. So we rather talk about co-leadership or assuming responsibility. But yes, there are some signals. Just one example, which has a relevance for the region. The chief of the German Navy, a couple of days ago, did a keynote address on a ship for the island of Rügen, where he said the German Navy is ready to do its job in the Baltic Sea, and it will offer NATO the establishment of a regional headquarters, for example. And he's aware of also the new challenges which will come. I mean, protection of critical infrastructure. Thomas talked about energy. Who will protect the offshore wind parks in the future in the region? Who will take care of logistics if you need follow-on forces reinforcing Baltic troops in the Baltic states? Navy will have an important role there. So we see it from the military leadership. I also think from the political leadership. But that's not a sprint, it's a marathon, where you have to include also the elements, to overcome the elements of inertia, which are part of the German DNA. Germany, as we all know, in the post-World War II decades, has been socialized has been defined as a country, as a civilian power. Yeah. And it does not know, to quote Mr. Borrell, or to use the language of Mr. Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union, Germany has not learned the language of power. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up a little bit with Robert specifically about energy policy in Germany. I mean, the German commitment to cutting energy ties with Russia has been very clearly defined, and we've heard Mr. Habeck, for instance, talk about this a lot and how much has already been reduced and what they plan to do by the end of this year and by 2025. What is your evaluation of this? I mean, do you think Germany will achieve this, and how will that change Germany's position in general in the region?
I think that Germany will achieve it, but it needs time. We have now a situation that we have growing gas crisis on the continent. Germany went on the second stage of gas alarm on the market. We have Nord Stream 1, which is working only with 40% of its capacity, and probably on the 11th of July it will stop totally, because there is a technical operation which is will make it to the zero. So Germany is facing a tremendous challenge. Energiewende is based on the assumption that Germany is phasing out coal power plants together with the nuclear, And till 24th of February, the gas was this transition fuel which was supposed to fill the gap in the base of the energy system. Now, without the Russian gas, Berlin looks for the opportunity to build floating facilities to get more gas from other sources, United States, from Qatar, from Middle East. But it will take some time. It means basically that Germany will import more electricity from Scandinavia. It will speed up the process of installing renewables, and of course ignite the question how long we can stay with coal. From the perspective of Poland, this is a really important question because Poland is most dependent country from coal in whole Europe. So it will give a challenge if we want to be carbon neutral and if we want to stay with our climate aims for 2030, we cannot use coal so much. So there will be a huge tension between what we need to do to save the planet, to stop the climate crisis, and the tension how to save our economies, our households, our bills. So this typical what to do with the end of the world or the end of the month. So this whole Europe will have to face this challenge. But on the other hand, we see growing interconnection and relation between the West, between United States and America. June was the first month when there was more LNG gas from United States coming to European market than Russian gas coming to Europe. So this is a historical moment. It shows that West is reminding itself that it can cooperate in achieving the climate neutrality, but also on the gas market. But on the other hand, it can push the process of deglobalization even further. We now think if we read, for example, the statement from G7 summit, we can see there that G7 countries wants to create climate club. What is climate club? Climate club, it's a place where countries will strongly cooperate with each other to push the price of CO2 higher and ask other countries to join. But they have to also introduce this kind of emission standard. It basically means that world economy can be more divided than ever because from one side we need to protect our economies from the carbon leakage and the other side we need to achieve climate neutrality goal.
Okay, we're speaking about all this. We can go off
very
in
broad,
many
yes.
directions. But I want, just briefly,
on Germany and energy. I mean, we have a problem because what also has been destroyed was this paradigm of interdependence in the energy sector. So our assumption in Germany was we need them, but they need us, and so it will be too costly for them to cut us off. Now we see that we were in a situation of asymmetry. Yeah. And that's a problem because, first of all, this double transition to CO2, to a CO2-free energy sector and business model, and getting rid of Russian gas especially, is highly ambitious. And we also have to take into account Germany is a big country. Lithuania, with the LNG in Klaipėda, with I think a capacity of 3.5 BCM, billion cubic meters a year, that's enough for Lithuania and probably also for Latvia and Estonia.
Not quite,
but Germany has 80 or 90 BCM a year. Yeah. So, and Mr. Habeck has to go to Qatar and elsewhere, and we have to build the infrastructures, the LNG terminals, and so on and so forth, where we're not really good at in having a speedy infrastructure constructions. So, politically and in terms of security policy, the problem is, will Germany, if it really gets, if it gets tough, and the German economy, which is a manufacturing economy, basically also highly interconnected with the Central European economies, car manufacturers in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, and so on, will there not be a certain pressure to German politics to be softer when it comes to security issues with regard to Russia in order to not run into this position where Russia will weaken us completely and where it will open an economic war with us.
We've talked now a lot about the security implications of the war in the non-military sense, but in ways that very directly impact on the economies and lifestyles of our countries. But I wanted to return a little bit to the hard security issues. We just had the Madrid summit, the NATO summit, which took a lot of important decisions about the security specifically also of our Baltic region. And the question is it enough? I mean, will the decisions taken at Madrid really be enough to tell Putin, stop, you can't go further. We will stop you if you try to do any more. And I'll ask Shell to comment on that, because one of the biggest decisions was the invitation for Sweden and Finland to join NATO. And so maybe you could talk about Madrid from this point of view.
Yeah, well, it's certainly not going to be enough. But going from 40,000 standby troops to 300,000 is a huge step, and that's certainly.
If we can figure out how to do that, because I understand that it's not quite sure where those 300,000 will come from.
Yeah. The Americans are talking about putting up 100,000, but the other 200,000 would have to come from the European allies. I mean, and from Canada, a couple of thousand probably. So huge problem in terms of implementation. That's for sure. But it's in terms of alliance politics, I would say. I think the Biden administration has a dream team and is doing really, really well. I don't want to criticize them for that. I have two other criticisms. One would be sometimes the strategic communication, the messaging, where they're, I think, a little too intimidated by the talk about nuclear weapons being used. Of course, the Americans have a lot of intelligence that I don't have access to, and perhaps they're assessing this correctly. But there's also a kind of a precautionary principle here, of course, that has to apply when you're dealing with that. But I think that they've been letting a little too much room to maneuver for the Putin regime militarily, I think, on a number of different fronts. One would be the combat aircraft, for instance. I mean, but we don't have time to go into all of these details. I think what is obvious to most military analysts is that not just will this war be decided on the battlefield, but the fate of the European security order will be decided on the battlefield. So that's why I and a lot of other people are worrying a lot about what will happen in terms of the actual conflict here, given that it stays within the confines of Ukraine, which is a premise I think we're all operating under right now. I don't see, I see a possibility of a military equilibrium evolving over the next couple of months. Perhaps 6 months, 9 months, and the situation in which the Ukrainian government will increasingly come under a lot of political and diplomatic pressure to do some kind of deal, even if it's just a temporary truce or something like that. And that will be then a stalemate that will be accepted by the Kremlin as a fait accompli, right? And with that, we have undermined the European security order. That is my problem.
And in view of this prognosis, and going back again to the question of the decisions taken at NATO, at the NATO summit, do you think that summit has sufficiently strengthened the security specifically of our region, or do you think more needs to be done here?
Yes, I think within the framework of the policies that the Biden administration has developed and with NATO, I think what we need now, I think, is more time just to absorb the changing security framework. And just looking at the Nordic and Baltic region, I think we will be able to organize ourselves militarily and security-wise within the next 5 to 10 years in ways that we can take care of our conventional deterrence here up in the Northeast.
Do we have 5 to 10 years?
That is more an apt question, but you started off also saying that the Russian armed forces are being depleted as we speak, and the problems of now replenishing them in terms of troops is an indication that this is probably likely to continue. So we may have a window of opportunity that's big enough. And also in terms of our economies, I don't know, Russia last year, GDP was 1.7 trillion. If you put together the Nordic and Baltic countries, we're 1.5 to 1.6 trillion. So we have the combined, the aggregate economic strength of the Nordic and Baltic region is certainly of the same size as the huge Russian Federation. And also I think we have a lot of companies, defense industry companies, other companies that are with a lot of creative people. So I think if you give this a couple of years, I think we'll be in pretty good shape. The nuclear umbrella we will need from NATO and from the US specifically.
Okay. Kyle, Madrid.
There is this notion of the Baltic states so far having been in a security policy situation like West Berlin during the Cold War. Well, we also had the presence of the French, the British, and the Americans.
And the Germans as well.
in a rather symbolic way, but it was highly important. But it was not, in a way, that militarily they had no chance against the Red Army. And now I think there is an opportunity that in some time the Baltic states overcome this status and will be, let's say, something like Norway in the Cold War. So Norway plus even. And I think one of the challenges now will be if we use this period where Russia is still absorbed by Ukraine and by the aftermath of Ukraine. I mean, we read that the 6th Army, which is in the Western military district in close vicinity to Estonia, to Latvia, that units from there, of course, have suffered enormous losses. The 76th Guard Airborne Division from Pskov also had losses there. These are indications that also important military capabilities which are a threat to the Baltic states have been reduced for the time being, and that in the upcoming years NATO will have to implement the decision, which is not so easy, I think. If you look at the German commitment, 15,000 soldiers to the NRF, to the response force, 65 aircraft and 20 ships. That's quite something, and that will not happen from today to tomorrow. So we need a little bit time. I think what we have to bear in mind in all our discussion is, I always call it the objective and the subjective factors. So what we are able to do and what we are willing to do. So what we are able to do means we have to create the conditions that we can respond. We have to do the infrastructures, we have to do the prepositioning, and so on and so forth. But then there is, and that's often underestimated, the political, the subjective factor. Who has the escalation dominance in strategic communication? And of course, Moscow exactly knows that we have timid societies in Germany, in France, a public opinion, which is not necessarily ready, this mourir pour Gdańsk. So are we ready to die for some towns far in the east? Are we ready to risk the Third World War in order to defend the northeastern part of Estonia? So I think we have to work very hard on communication and of preserving this risk assessment we have at the moment. Also in Germany we have it, but I'm a little bit worried that in a situation of, I would not say peace, but relative fragile stability in a sort of after war situation, old patterns might come back in at least some societies of Western Europe.
I wanted to just intervene a bit.
Germany, we live in a world of Immanuel Kant. Our foreign policy is oriented towards this perpetual peace project of multilateralism, but de facto we live in the world of Carl Schmitt of enemies and of the struggle for the control of territory.
Of course, I mean, I think Kant, if I read him correctly, would say that the world of perpetual peace exists between democracies, right? And we are not dealing with a democracy in Russia. But I don't think we should get into the discussion about Kant's philosophy. I just wanted to intervene a little bit about the Baltic states' view of Madrid. I think it was very significant from our point of view that we really see a move from deterrence, which was the West Berlin model, to defense, which is that we want to have sufficient forces here that we can defend the territory from the first day rather than trying to reconquer it after some period of time. But I wanted to ask Robert, I mean, Poland would never be accused of being too reticent in its attitude to the defense and against Russia. There's been a decision now to permanently base U.S. forces in Poland. And just asking you to move a little bit outside of your comfort zone, talking about energy, just about this decision. Is it everything Poland wanted? Did Poland want more? Because I know that the Baltic states would be very happy to have U.S. forces permanently based here. We haven't gotten that. I mean, the U.S. presence will be about 1,000 troops. Is this enough, or do you think that we should be asking for more from the U.S.?
There is this case of the headquarters of the 5th Corps, which will be in Poznan, that's right. But Warsaw was trying to convince United States to put some permanent forces in Poland. And this aim was not achieved. So from the perspective of our strategic security and also the security of the region, this lack of permanent American forces on Polish ground is still some problem and something to achieve in coming years. But on the other hand, we cannot forget that security situation after 24th of February drastically strengthened Polish position of Baltic states, the accession of Finland, Sweden. Baltic Sea becomes the internal lake of NATO. Poland now has more strategic advantage in terms of seeing Russian forces in Kaliningrad, in Belarus. Of course, we are experiencing some problems and fears connected with what will happen with Belarus and the possibility of annexation of this country by Russia in coming months. But becoming a frontline country was something that Polish elite was expecting and willing to strengthen our position, to put more money to the defense industry, and especially to put more Americans on the ground. From my perspective, this is also important because we have debate about the nuclear power plant, and it's strengthened the position of American companies to build it here in Poland. So I think this is the case.
Shall we talk about the Baltic Sea being a NATO lake, but Finland and Sweden are not yet members, and we saw the difficulties that we had getting to Madrid to have Erdogan, the Turkish president, accept this invitation. And now we hear these rumors that he said, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean I'll accept them actually joining. What's your feeling about this? First of all, will this be a real problem? Will it be overcome as it was in Madrid, or is this a problem we're going to have to be working with over the coming years?
First, I just wanted to mention that Sweden and Finland will not want a permanent American base on their territory. And that, I think, is, as I read some of Putin's statements personally over the past couple of weeks also, I think that's something he wants to avoid as well. So here there may be some kind of continuity perhaps with a less tense situation in that part of it. When it comes to Erdogan, it's about as easy to predict his actions and statements as his colleague in the Kremlin. It's just very difficult to understand the exact mindset. We believe that there are three sets of concerns here. One is about exiled political groups, especially Kurds, but also critical journalists. We have 100,000 plus Kurds in Sweden, and we have a couple of parliamentarians even. So that is probably a factor that is annoying Erdogan, and in the era of social media, their activism in Sweden is affecting the political landscape in Turkey. And so that's kind of just the new situation in which we live. The second factor that we know is important to Erdogan is arms exports. Here, I think he's probably less interested in, we do have a big defense industry, we have combat aircraft, we have artillery, we have submarines. I don't think he's mainly out to buy them. I think he's using Sweden as a vehicle to make the EU or the US relax some of the export limitations so that he can get his F-16s or whatever he's in for. But the third dimension is, I think, the domestic political situation. Erdogan is really low in the polls right now, and we are going to see elections in Turkey, presidential and parliamentary, in mid-June next year. So if Erdogan can get away with it, I think he would like to drag out this bashing of Swedes and Turks over the Kurdish issue or terrorism that he ascribes to a number of these political exile groups as long as he can. And the question I don't think the Swedes and the Finns are strong enough, perhaps for themselves, to stand up to this. It will have to require, I think, very strong diplomatic support from the big European countries and eventually, I think, from the US as a kind of a closer of this deal. So yes, this will continue to upset, I think, especially the Swedish political landscape, but also the Finnish, which are, according to a poll, almost 80% of Finns think that we shouldn't give anything to Erdogan. He's obviously blackmailing us, and so they don't want any kind of compromise. So that's also a kind of political dynamic that is entering here, a bit unexpectedly, I think, for the Swedish and Finnish governments.
Kai-Olof, you mentioned Immanuel Kant. He was from Königsberg, now known as Kaliningrad, which has become a new source of tension, possibly, between Russia and the West. What's your analysis? I know that you recently did a paper, a podcast about this. What's your analysis about how sensitive this situation is? And we hear talk that Germany is pressuring Lithuania to relax these restrictions on Russian transit to Kaliningrad. Is that right in your opinion, or?
Kaliningrad and everything which is connected to that unsinkable aircraft carrier of Russia in the region is, of course, at least a potential hotspot. And I think we have to be very careful not to create at the moment a new escalation dynamics which NATO will not be able to control. Kaliningrad is, strictly speaking, not an enclave, it's a semi-enclave. Yeah? It's not surrounded completely by NATO countries, it has access to the open sea. Yeah. That's why it can be, why the goods and also the military transit goes to Kaliningrad, not via the territory of Lithuania. Kaliningrad, of course, I think has always been an asset for Russia, a geostrategic asset towards NATO, and Russia can use it, can instrumentalize it also to pressure vis-à-vis the West. So I read the German efforts in order to do a little bit of to try to not evoke another point of emergency coming out when we have the whole problems with Ukraine. Second on the US. I mean, the US is the indispensable security anchor for the region. However, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic endeavor, and I see a role for the Baltic states, for Latvia, for the future NATO countries, for Germany, also for Poland, but probably not with the current government, to work exactly for that. My impression was that the current Polish government, before the war, in the years before the war, was heavily investing in bilateral US-American security and defense and armaments cooperation. very much investing also politically in contacts with the Trump administration, which was a bit tricky after the handover in the White House. And that's on one hand understandable, yeah, because there is much higher trust in the US and in European allies. But I think for the cohesion, also for the political cohesion of the alliance, it's very important that also France and Germany and others are engaged. And what I see is a quite heterogeneous Central Eastern Europe. I was recently in Prague, and I talked about a country which has not met the 2% goal of NATO, where you have a strong pro-Russian pragmatic strand in public opinion, in the political scenery, where we have strong economic bonds. And I was asked, and where we have a high dependency on energy, and I asked my Czech colleagues, which country am I talking about, the Czech Republic or Germany? Yeah, because we have both a mixed approach. In the Baltic states, I would say these are frontline countries which have been very critical towards Germany's Russland politik, Nord Stream 2 and so on and so forth. At the same time, they are very grateful for the announcement to deploy more soldiers in Lithuania. They have appreciated what the Bundeswehr has done. And I have heard speaking, I was on a panel discussion with a high-ranking Polish former politician, high-ranking former politician from the current government camp, and he said, and I asked him, do you want German military on the ground in Poland? And I said, for me, Germany is Russia's Trojan horse, so I don't want to have German troops. And Mr. Kaczynski, the chairman of the leading Polish party, recently said, I see that Germany is arming, but I'm not sure if they are arming against Russia or against us. So that's not really something which talks about trust, which to some extent I understand, but it's not something which furthers the cohesion of the alliance. So yes, we need this American, the Russians would say the American vector, in Europe and in the region, but we also need to take care of the transatlantic and of the Euro-Atlantic character of the measures we have.
Okay. Just before I opened up to questions, I just had this brief comment about Kaliningrad, because I raised that because I recently had an interview with the former commander of the Latvian Armed Forces, and I asked him about this, and he said, Lithuanians are doing exactly the right thing. I mean, it's according to the law, and the Russians are just blustering, right? And it seems to me that, again, we're seeing sort of divergence here, because from the Latvian, and I think from the Polish point of view as well, Russia responds to strength. And as Shell mentioned, in November they said, no more NATO expansion. This is a red flag. We'll just wipe you off the face of the earth if there's more NATO expansion. Now we see that there's an invitation to Sweden and Finland, and Putin saying, that's not such a big deal, just as long as there's no new infrastructure, right? So, I mean, maybe just tell them, you have sea lanes. You're not cut off. Just use the ships, and you'll be fine. But that's from the Baltic point of view.
What's behind that? I once wrote a comment on Germany and Poland and our different threat perceptions. And I think it also holds true for Germany and Latvia probably. And I said, Poles are afraid of nothing except for Russia. Germans are afraid of everything except for Russia. So we have the German Angst, yeah. So and now the question is if this will change in a way. But it comes here again, the language of power or the language of let's be cautious, we have to do something, but we should not be too risky. Yeah.
So just one sentence for me to comment the change of the approach after 24th of February in Poland in terms of the security feeling. So in my opinion, this change was the war made Polish elites believe that only American guarantees can be trustful. And policy of France, Germany towards Ukraine about looking for some diplomatic solution, talking with Putin all the time, it created very big fear in Warsaw that no, we cannot trust building independent European security, and we need additional help from United States in those terms. It was, of course, present before 24th February, but war really strengthened it. And I think it would be really hard to change it if, for example, European Union would like to go on the next level in its security cooperation. here Poland and the rest of countries in the region also probably will try to keep those American guarantees as an important factor of their feeling being safe.
Thank you, Rod. Okay, we have 10 minutes for questions. There's a question over there, a question over there. Where are the volunteers with the chat box? There's a question over there. I saw that over there first. Tur, ne, tālāk, tur, jā.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a very excellent presentation, and all of those were very interesting, actually. I have a question to Professor Lang. Well, you mentioned American vector, and then somewhat you talked about submissive German pacifism. Then you said that Germans are afraid of everything except Russia. This is really, well, I cannot understand. Well, actually, the funny thing is, it's 100 years since Rapallo Agreement. Germany signed with Soviet Russia of cooperation, military, economic, political. And already at the end of 20s and 30s, German soldiers were trained on the Soviet battlefields. And I'm not going to mention more of those coming up. But when you go through this history, you see so many cases of deal-making. And this deal-making is obvious, unobvious. You see, well, German Gref sitting on the Munich Council Advisory Board after Crimea, after invasion into Ukraine, and it seems like all right with the German elites. So are you saying that the Russlandpolitik is coming back? Are you suggesting that the Ostpolitik is coming back despite of whatever is happening in the region? Thank you.
When I said Germans are afraid of everything, but except for Russia, man, this is changing a bit after February the 24th. Yeah, that's if you look at the opinion polls, we also have a perception which is changing. So that was the traditional assessment. But of course, I mean, Germany was also the old Germany, the Federal Republic, was also a frontline state. Yeah, and here we have many analogies to the debates in the Baltic states or in Poland now. So we also wanted to have, and we had, quite some boots on the ground and American hardware. Yeah, but and we also had, I think, in some moments, even a 3% share of GDP for defense in the Cold War. But this situation and the mental self-identification have vanished after 1989, 1990, immediately. And then Germany became a sort of, on the one hand, Germany was an engine for the Eastern enlargement of EU, of NATO. It was a bit reluctant with the Baltic states, to be frank, at the beginning. We
read the Spiegel article.
Yeah, but when it was done, it accepted it, as I think mentally, as in contradistinction to other Western European countries. So what I just want to say is there are some stable elements of continuity which are not so easy to change, and then there is the moment of fear, and then it's a challenge for the political leadership to balance this, to bring this in advance. So what I think is good news also for Latvia is probably that Germany has done things which were not imaginable a couple of years ago. And the fact that the Bundeswehr is in Lithuania before February the 24th, that was quite something which you would not have accepted 10 years ago. The fact that Germany accepted the candidate status for Ukraine, which is also a sort of geostrategic signal, notwithstanding how it's going to play out at the very end, that shows that Germany has not accepted a droit de regard, a Russian veto power about the kind of foreign policy orientation of Ukraine. Yes, with regard to NATO, Germany was modest and opposed to it, but not with regard to EU, which might also be a conflict in the future with Russia. So a little bit, when it comes to Germany and the changes, someone described it in a quite apt way, I think, is that if you look at grass, you don't see that it's growing. If you look 10 minutes, 1 hour, 5 hours, nothing is changing. But if you come back 5 days, 10 days, you see that it has grown. So sometimes it takes change, particularly in a relatively big country.
Okay. There was another question over here I saw. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is also about Germany. Don't you think Germany is a little bit too cautious all the time because of the past? And Germany is not really a threat to any European country anymore, right, for a long time already. And vis-a-vis Russia and also Israel, Germany is very reluctant to confront these countries because of the past, as opposed to like standing up for values of democracy and human rights and so on.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's to Kayolf as well, unless.
And from the point of view of Italy, France, or other European countries, Germany is probably not very reluctant. So Germany is in the middle, in a way. Yeah, and of course you see the effects of a country which has for decades benefited from protection without having foreign policy, complete foreign and security policy sovereignty. So we were in a quite convenient position. Security, although we had a strong Bundeswehr in the Cold War, but in a way it was outsourced geostrategically. And so these are elements which describe this reluctance. And so Germany, I think, has a 360 degrees approach traditionally. And I would agree to you that we have, and I try to be a Polen-Versteher and the Baltikums-Versteher to understand what is going on, what the debates in these countries are. But of course, the average politician and the average mindset in Germany has a little bit suffered this deficit of empathy with the Central Europeans. At the same time, and that refers to the question on Ostpolitik, is there a return to Ostpolitik? No, I don't think so. We also have witnessed an evolution in Germany. I had numerous debates with colleagues from the Baltic States or Poland when they said, you have a Russian first policy and we have a Ukraine first policy. And at the beginning it was even worse. We had a Russian only policy. I don't know when in the 1990s how often German politicians went to Ukraine. Yeah? So we had a Russia only, then we had a Russia first, and then we discovered the relevance of Ukraine. And Germany accepted, reluctantly, but yes, the association with Ukraine. And Germany, at the beginning, tried to establish a geopolitical triangle with the EU, Russia, and the Eastern Partnership countries to have a sort of cooperative, harmonious cooperation, which never did work because Russia didn't want it. Also, these illusions have disappeared. So I think if there is something like an Eastern policy, it will not be the Ostpolitik, but it will be an attempt to strengthen, to solidify, and to Europeanize countries like Ukraine. And the big question mark is what the place of Russia in the future, I don't like the notion, security architecture of Europe is going to be. And I think here we have a lot to debate. Germany, Latvia, Poland, also the US. What will be the future lines? I think what I hear from the US, from Central Eastern Europe is we have to do at least containment, but maybe even more. And Germany says containment as we have it now is the maximum. And last sentence, as I once heard a US general who said, with regard to the enhanced forward present decisions of the NATO summits, the NATO summit in Warsaw, he said, for us Americans and for you in the Baltic States, it was the way not to Warsaw, but the way through Warsaw. For Germany, it was probably the way to Warsaw, and we will have the same debates with Madrid. Mm-hmm. Is it the way to Madrid, and that's the end of the story, and we have to implement that, which is a big concern, or will we have to do more?
Okay. We have time for one more brief question. Ambassador, please.
Thank you. Perfect bridging, posture post-Madrid. Chancellor Scholz has done a bilateral agreement with President Nausėda of Lithuania some 2 weeks ago on the future posture of the EFP there. Then backtracking. I really don't see it. It's the forward pre-positioning. My impression is that Madrid hasn't provided any other practical solution to enhancing the defense posture for the other framework nations. Is that the same setup we're going to be seeing, or is there a big qualitative difference between the EFPs we're going to see in the Baltic states? Thank you.
Question addressed to... Anyone want to pick this up? Shell, maybe you have something to say about it?
No, not really. I think I think if we're just absorbed with the NATO accession issue, and I think that is much more consequential than anything that will happen on the European side. I think the European side, the military mobility is really important, and I think the funding that goes into defense industry technology development, those are the two components, I think. But apart from that, I think I think you have to start building defense capability nationally still. I mean, and then you have to add these national capabilities to each other. And that's why I actually welcome the regionalization. That seems to be part of the package of the Madrid summit. I think that makes a lot of sense. It especially makes sense in this part of the world. It's just that we need 5, 10, 15 years perhaps before we get up to speed and all these things start functioning together smoothly.
Just in conclusion, I'd like to say that from the Baltic point of view, I think we're a little concerned about a potential regionalization, because you hear this talk about the Americans saying, okay, now the Swedes and the Finns can take care of the Baltic states, we can move off and worry about Taiwan. It's not exactly something that we would like to hear, because we also see the American guarantee is very important. And talking about the decisions in Madrid, from the Latvian point of view, I think that the agreements with Canada and the Canadian commitment to increase their presence here, and also the promises of a very significant increase in infrastructure, air defense and coastal defense, are something that we see as very important. But obviously, what this means, a decision taken at Madrid is just sort of saying, okay, we're willing to go in this direction, but Latvia, you have to go out and talk to these concrete countries individually and get them to come and get them to commit. So it's, it's just the start of the road, actually. Madrid it's not, we end at Madrid, we go through Madrid to the next stage, as Kai said. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. We actually ran over time a bit, but this is obviously, everybody's talking about this. We had this 1-hour discussion. There are other discussions where you can pick up on these issues as well here in LAMPA. Thank you very much to the panel. I think it's been an excellent discussion, and I think we got a very tour d'horizon, as they say. No French here, but that's what we got here from around the Baltic Sea. Thank you to everybody who is here to listen. Paldies visiem, kas atnāca. Redzēsimies atkal turpmāk. Visu labu.